Hello, so today patch 13.6 came out of TFT, and we're going to be talking about 3 of the better forecast comps and reroll comps that you can use to help you climb. Obviously the patch came out just today, and this is based on very short experience of my own of trying out the patch, but these are things to get you a little bit of a head start on the current patch, as well as to have a little bit of maybe success and some learning of some of the comps that are looking like they are the more stronger options currently. So, before we get started, please make sure to like and subscribe. I do daily TFT content, by which I am doing mostly guides and more informed, analysis and how to play guides. If that's something that interests you, please make sure to like and subscribe, because it does help me out as a small content creator. Additionally, I also have my store where I have art. I'm going to be finishing some art by the end of the month, and there'll be some new products that will be there as well. I do conventions and stuff like that, so I'm going to be doing that in May, so I'm working on art on the side. But anyways, let's get to it. So, what we're going to do is we're going to go through 3 non-reroll comps, just 3 forecast comps. I know you can see the Twitch on the screen. We're going to talk about Twitch in a second. When I'm saying that these are good comps, I'm not saying that these are the end-all be-all, the greatest comps ever. It's just what I look at when I watch other people play, and what I look at when I'm in my own lobbies and playing on the current patch. These are the ones that are looking to be a little bit more consistent and a little bit stronger than the other ones. So I'm trying to give you guys a little bit of a head start, and of course things can be optimized and altered as the patch goes on and people figure out more. So one of the big changes that happened in the patch notes was to snipers, and it kind of feels like Twitch is getting on the up and up and being a little bit more of a reliable forecast comp. I would go as far to say that you should often, if you're looking for a forecast comp to default to, Twitch might be the answer for this patch. Now, with Twitch, there's many different boards, and I'm not sure which one is the quote unquote optimized strongest board, but typically when you're playing Twitch, you play them around Experiment. The Experiment bonus on Twitch is quite substantial in that it ups his damage a lot, and because he has the piercing effect where he hits many backline units, it helps him to delete many of the backline units. So often when you're playing Twitch, you're trying to fit in 3 Experiment around Mundo with your main tank, and you usually play a Nunu for his synergies. And then with the 3 Experiment, you're often very flexible. So this was something that has existed a couple of patches ago, and this was like the Twitch flex board. You can often play Twitch with full bruisers as well. If you have a bruiser +1, you can put it on the Mundo. Or if you have an Experiment +1, you'll also have a lot more flexibility. But before, you can just play a 6 bruiser front line and put bruiser emblem on Mundo. That was a go-to option. If you don't have any emblems and you're just trying to play default Twitch, this used to be one of the boards that you can try and strive towards. Obviously, just upgrade, try and cap out around as many 5 costs as you can, but typically just have a lot of variable placement of whatever extra units you can play besides the Mundo and the Twitch. Whenever you think about Twitch, Twitch is a unit that wants to auto attack a bunch, so you definitely want to build him with a Guinsoo if possible. With the Guinsoo, a lot of times you can pair it with other attack speed items, but a lot of times I go for some sort of crit build. Something like a Last Whisper IE is good, and then you can eventually move the Last Whisper onto another unit, but it's just an idea of pairing some extra crit damage on the Twitch so that he gets a little bit more value out of those auto attacks. But of course, you can pair this with a different glove item like a guard breaker that will probably be a little bit more high cap on the Twitch eventually, after you deal with having your Shred and your Sunder dealt with. A lot of times this board with Twitch, though, however, is very dependent on finding a Caitlyn. While Twitch does the auto attacking ramp up type of damage, Twitch is really good at meshing with that and doing a lot of burst damage. And because Twitch is really positionally dependent, because of the way Sniper works, you want to have him on the opposite side of the carry, but because of the way Experiment works, he's often stuck in one of the corners wherever the Experiment hex is. Caitlyn kind of allows that board to not have problems in late game fight scenarios where damage is more optimized and people have more swollen boards with beefier tanks and beefier backline units. So a lot of times when you're playing this board, you really want to find a Caitlyn, because while Twitch is going to ramp up and do his damage over time, the Caitlyn's going to do burst damage, which will help you deal with some of the larger threats and some of the backline units. So because of that, a lot of times with Caitlyn, you really only care about her casting, so mana items, either a Shojin or a blue buff, but blue buff is a little bit better for her. And then you can move a lot of the big damage items, like the crit items from the Twitch. You can build them full attack speed and then put the big damage items like an IE, guard breaker, things that give her a bunch of damage amp and crit chance to the Caitlyn in order to maximize the amount of damage that she's doing. Now, in terms of the Twitch boards, there's many other variations of the boards. So for example, you can play around 5 experiment as well. This is just like something that's a little bit more cheap, so you can play it a little bit more easily on level 8. Obviously, I have the Jace here. There are variations where you can play 4 form swapper, but a lot of times I'm just putting Jace here because he's a pretty flexible option where you can play him as a frontline or a backline unit. If you don't have a Jace, you can play another form swapper. If you don't have any of those, you can just try and find a little bit more frontline, because often if you're playing Twitch, you need him to ramp up the Gwynsu, so you don't want your frontline to be very, lacking in strength. But 5 experiment, just you get a little bit more HP on your units, so your Twitch is a little bit less susceptible to getting sniped himself, and just have the beefiness from the extra experiment HP bonuses that you can put on the Mundo, as well as another experiment unit. A lot of times you put Urgot because of the attack speed and the shielding that works out really nicely with the Mundo and the Twitch. This is another variation. Something that might become a little bit more prevalent in this patch is Force Sniper. Force Sniper got a massive buff. It's just like the base damage amp that it gives you, in addition to the hexes that it gives you, makes this comp very burst damageable. Now, this is a variation that I think is entirely dependent on you finding a Caitlyn. I don't think you can really play this if you don't have a Caitlyn on level 8. So it's more of a tempo type of comp, and it kind of really hinges around you finding a Garen 2-star. But with this type of build, basically what you're doing is you're saying to yourself, I can sacrifice some of my front line, and instead of playing deeper into a frontline trait or playing experiment, which ups my damage of my Twitch, I will compensate that with Force Sniper. Now, like I said before, I think it's entirely dependent on the Caitlyn, because if you losing experiment bonus on Twitch, his damage does drop quite a bit. You do get the damage from Force Sniper, but it's often a little bit bait because you lack a lot of frontline here. 4 Watcher is pretty sustainable. There's also variations of this where instead of 4 Watcher, you can play 4 Sentinel. You can also play around Bruisers. But there's many different builds, as you can see with the Twitch. Nobody's sure exactly which one is the best one. The two here, the 5 experiment, the 3 experiment versions, these are ones that are a little bit easier, in my opinion, to kind of like stabilize around, just because like you have a lot to roll for on level 8, and you can kind of play around it on level 8. In addition, like if you're talking about this basic board with experiment, you can also play the Bruiser variation if you end up hitting a Bruiser +1. So that variation just looks like, one second, like I'm looking for this, and then a Bruiser emblem. Right, it looks a little bit like this. This was a very common build. I think this build is also quite strong. It's just like, but you're not really playing deeper into the sniper trait. Bruiser it doesn't really feel that great unless you have 6 Bruiser in, and this still allows you to get the experiment bonus, so you don't necessarily need to like crux yourself around 4 sniper. But with this variation, right, I think 4 Watcher is pretty strong. Garen is one of the better tanks that you can play around, as opposed to like Alawi without Rebel is a little bit less tanky, and Elise is a little bit less tanky. So if you're looking for a 4-cost tank, Garen of the main frontline synergies is a little bit easier to stabilize around. But like I said, you really want to have the burst damage on the Caitlyn here. A lot of times this might be more of a Caitlyn carry style of game. Now obviously there are reroll options playing around Zeri, which we will talk about when we talk about rerolls, but for now this was the first 4-cost comp that we wanted to talk about, and now I'm going to give you 2 more. So the second comp, this one's an oldie goldie that you probably remember from last patch, Sorks. Now, Sorks did get quite a few nerfs. The main nerfs that Sorks got was just like a high cap, like, like 6 Sork got a little bit of an AP drop. But additionally, LeBlanc got a lot of nerfs. So when I think about Sorks now, I don't think it's a necessarily default comp. I don't think that you look at it and you say to yourself, it's a Sork game, because a lot of last patch revolved around you defaulting to Sorks. That's just kind of how the patch played out last patch. If you don't have a spot for reroll, Sorks and you had AP items was the go-to. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think because of the nerfs to LeBlanc especially, a lot of times with Sorks, if you found a LeBlanc, you were giga stable, and that's what made it so powerful. And if you didn't have LeBlanc, the massive amount of damage you had gave you a lot of flexibility and a lot of power. I still think Sorks is really strong this patch, but I just want to mention these nerfs because obviously you want to be careful if you're contested on it now. You want to make sure that you're playing it from a good spot, so to speak. But when you're thinking about your fully capped Sork board, there is 2 different variations. The first one is just like Black Rose Sorks. You get a lot of cheap frontline from Black Rose. The comp is very burst damage based because Sorks gets a lot of AP up front. So with the amount of burst damage that you have, you can rely on not having as strong of a front line. But so typically the Black Rose helps to mediate that because your front line's a little bit weak because you're usually relying on Swain as your main tank or Elise as your main tank, and Elise is pretty contested. You can play around this, get an extra Scion, and then that usually gives you enough time to do your burst damage. Now, when you're doing this type of build, you want to pair the massive amount of AP that you get on the Sork units with some sort of amplification. You either want to give them a bunch of crit chance so that they're critting their abilities. You want to give them a bunch of damage amps so they have some way of multiplying the massive amount of AP that they have in their ults. So a lot of times when I'm building around Zoe, you want to try and prioritize making a Jewel Gauntlet and a Guard Breaker, either or both, ideally. Guard Breaker is an item that's really good because it gives you crit chance because it has the crit glove item. So if you pair it with either an augment that makes your ability crit or a Jewel Gauntlet which makes your ability crit, it's a really good item pairing in those cases. Additionally, it gives you damage amp, and it's one of the better damage amp items because the condition for activating the damage amp is pretty common and often could be applied. LeBlanc, you usually want to build her with more attack speed. Here I put a Shojin on Zoe. You can also build her with attack speed like a Guinsoo, but that's more of a rebel style build. LeBlanc, you have the she like gets mana locked a lot of the times, and she like tries to like auto attack a bunch when she does her ult. So typically you just want to build it with attack speed. So Guinsoo, red buff, bow items in general, any item that is made with a bow is something you should look at and think to yourself, yeah, that's something that I would like to put on LeBlanc, just because all bow items give some sort of attack speed. I also put Guard Breaker here. You can easily put the same items that you put on Zoe on the LeBlanc. You're pretty flexible in your backline, but I just gave you like a rough, like, you know, hey, here are some items you can put on the unit. Obviously, like, you can put other units, other items, and other units and stuff. But this is a Black Rose variation. There are many different variations. If you have a Sork +1, it also makes it a little bit easier to play different variations. You can also play around 4 Emissary. This was used to be like one of the high cap versions, but I think it's a little bit harder to achieve. Garen, I think, might be a little bit more contested by not just Sork players, but by other players, which we'll talk about in a second because of Watcher buffs that occurred. He might be more of a common chase unit in reroll comps as well. But you can play around 4 Emissary with 6 Sork, but typically when you're playing this variation, in order to fit everything in, it's often better with a Sork +1, which then you can put on the Elise. So we'll look something like this, and then you can drop one of the low-cost Sork units. Additionally, you can stabilize around Rebel with the Zoe. You could just play Sentinel with Alawi and Irelia if you hold on to the Irelia and the Alawi, and then you're not playing Emissaries, for example. And you could also stabilize around Form Swapper, from which they got a little bit of a buff. So often you can play like a 4 Form Swapper frontline if you find a Jace early. So that is another option for you. Either way, Sorks is always super flexible just by the way that the trait kind of synergizes with the other traits that are there. So there's many different options you have to stabilize, and a lot of playing Sorks comes down to, you know, exercising the muscle of understanding what to stabilize around with on your level 4 roll down. I've talked about this more extensively in Sork guides, which you can look at. I have a how to play Sork guide if that's something that you really need to check in on. Oh, sorry, I deleted Elise by accident. Boom. Anyways, so Sorks I still think are good, just a lot worse from last patch, but still at a point they were like really broken last patch. Now they're kind of like good, if that makes sense. The last comp that I want to talk about, I was kind of struggling for a third one. I think that between Sorks and like Sorks is probably the better AP line. Playing around Twitch is probably the best AD line. Right now, if you look at some of the other 4 costs, like Echo and Scrap is a little bit awkward to play around. Enforcers is always something that you can play around if you have a lot of tempo. Something that I think is a little bit better this patch, just by nature of everything else getting a little bit nerfed and a lot of bad matchups getting nerfed, is Academy. So I'm using the third one as Academy. I might not be 100% right on this, because often whenever it's a new patch, Academy is a really reliable comp, so often it looks a little bit better than it is, I find. And that's just because Academy is really stable. So especially if you're a beginner player, if you're just starting out playing the game, that's why I always talk about Academy in these type of guides, because Academy benefits from playing around a really strong front line, and you have multiple different types of damage dealers in the back line. So if you can just play around this board, it's very hard to miss, and it's also very easy to stabilize often, and it still has high roll potentials, especially if you hit certain emblems, which I think, you know, as like I talk or listen to beginner players, a lot of times, like, you know, emblems are really easy augments that's like, oh yes, that's the thing that I need, you take it and it helps your board out. Academy is kind of like a catch-all, which is why I always put it in these type of guides. But just be warned, it's probably not going to be as strong as Twitch, and it does have a bad matchup into Twitch. So unless you have some tempo, I wouldn't necessarily gear myself towards Academy unless I have like a lot of HP, right? I wouldn't play this from like 10 HP and think I'm going to win out, right? It's not a win out comp. It's like a stable comp that you aim for, that like middle of the pack, like, you know, 3rd to 5th for your score. And then you still have the potential to high roll. But anyways, enough said. Academy is super stable. A lot of times you're playing around 4 Sentinel. Often if you have a Sentinel emblem, then you can actually play around 6 Sentinel and cap out really high with a very strong front line. A lot of times the comp feels a little bit dependent on Jace, but you're usually trying to stabilize around Heimer and then some rendition of either Corki and Ezreal. Your backline, often if you're playing around Heimerdinger, things like blue buff is almost essential just because of the way the nerfs have gone and the way the patches have worked out. Shojin doesn't really cut it that much anymore, but you know, if you have to, you can make Shojin. Typically all of your AP items could go on the Heimerdinger, but a lot of times it's like blue buff and then like damage I like to see. So like, you know, Guard Breaker and Jewel Gauntlet, something like that. A lot of times on Corki, you can build them in a AD kind of way. These also work for Ezreal and Jace. So whatever AD items you have, a lot of times, just by nature of like having a bunch of damage amp and having a bunch of AD, typically I like to build around crit. So, you know, i.e. Guard Breaker, Crit Glove item, and abilities Crit and Crit Glove item typically work well on all of these units. Of course, you want to play around your Academy items. Wherever the Academy items are will give damage amp to the Academy units, as well as give HP to the Academy units as well. Additionally, if you have an Academy +1, you can then try and squeeze in a Lux and play around 6 Academy. I don't think it's necessary to ever go to 5 or 6 Academy, because I think it's better just to play a little bit more into frontline and maybe use my gold to play around Jace. A lot of times, if you find an early Rumble, you might even be able to drop Rebel if you don't have a Sentinel +1. And your Alawi is like, you know, maybe even if she's your main tank, Rebel's pretty important. But sometimes you can drop these units to fit a Rumble. Rumble got nerfed a lot in the most recent patch. Rumble is not super stable early game because they, like, not only did they nerf his damage quite a bit, like I think it was around a 10% nerf to his main damage, but the main nerf that Rumble got was that he got less armor and MR. Now, even though he's a Sentinel, the base armor and MR is actually a substantial nerf to him, and it makes him a lot less tanky in the early game. So if you find an early Rumble, a lot of times you want to play it to get those Rumble upgrades, and that's especially important in a comp like this where it helps you to cap out really high. But just be warned, you're not going to be like, oh, I hit a Rumble, I win out for free, GG, it's easy clap. It's like, not necessarily. The Rumble's kind of going to be useless on your board for a while. If you have an Academy +1, a lot of times the best holder of it is still the Rumble, in my opinion. Rumble makes use of both the HP, being a Sentinel, and the damage amp, being a large damage dealer. So if you find an early Rumble, that's another way you can high roll with this comp. But of course, on level 8, you're probably missing Jace. You can play Lux instead, or you can play around 6 Sentinel early and then transition that into your late game. I think this is one of the more reliable comps to play around. I don't think it's necessarily the highest cap best comp, right? You can obviously play around Enforcers, right? If we're talking about comps that maybe have better numbers and could, you know, if you're playing for more of a 1st or 8th, right, and you have a better spot for it, things like Enforcers around Caitlyn and Vi likely could be a little bit stronger. Things like Form Swapper, if you high roll that, might be stronger. Things like even Dominator might be a little bit more like high cap if you can stabilize around your Mordekaiser too. But the reason I show Academy, like I said, I think it's, you can't go wrong with it, especially in the current patch. Now, we just finished talking about our 4-cost comps. Now we're going to talk about our reroll comps. So this is where the big shakeup has happened in the current patch. You're going to see 3 probably different reroll comps than any of the other patch reviews. I think that they kind of gutted a lot of the reroll comps that existed in the last patch, and instead kind of buffed a lot of ones that were kind of like okay, or kind of like the second fiddle reroll comps. So I think it kind of just completely flipped itself on its head, which could have big repercussions for understanding of like the meta and the different comps that synergize well, because a lot of comps that are weak because they have bad matchups. A lot of comps that are strong because they have good matchups. So now that all the rerolls have changed, if lobbies become very reroll focused, it's hard to tell which 4-cost comp kind of slots in really nicely into these comps. So the first one that I want to talk about is Quick Strikers. Now there's 2 things. Number 1, there was not a B patch, but there was on the actual patch, the patch note said that Quick Striker got a buff to the shielding on 4 Quick Striker, that buff was not put through. That buff was just like they said that it was too much and they decided not to last, I don't know when, but it's not live. So the Quick Striker 4 did not get the buff that it said that it got. That's not why Quick Strikers is broken. It's mostly because of the changes to both Automata and Akali. This Akali unit was already kind of demon-like before. TF was also kind of demon-like before. So now all of a sudden, give everybody a little bit of a buff, and all of a sudden it's going to be a broken comp. There's 2 main versions of Quick Strikers that you should know to play. One of them is the 4 Quick Striker 4 Sentinel board. So Sentinel works really well, just giving everybody some extra armor, and also has synergy with Rebel that you can get the Rebel bonus on Akali, as well as get the Enforcer bonus on the TF. Now, there's different ways to cap out this board based on what you're playing. That's the key aspect of it. If you're playing primary towards 2-cost reroll, and you're going for Akali 3 and Nocturne 3, then this is a board that you would play, and you would probably roll on level 6 and go for your 2-star 3 costs. Additionally, this is a comp that also works really well with TF reroll. TF reroll, a lot of times you might want to drop some of the Sentinels, or you want to maybe have an emblem so you can play deeper into the Enforcer trait. Something like 4 Enforcer or even 6 Enforcer might work out really strong. But if you're rolling for 3 costs, you're rolling on level 7, and then you're going for Loris 3 as well. So this one is something that works out pretty nicely that way. If you think about itemizations, let me just find all of the items. So typically with Akali, I kind of like the crit on Akali because I think that she just deletes units and heals a bunch. So I like, Guard Breaker, Jewel Gauntlet. That's a very similar trend. I'm a big fan of those item pairs. I think in the current meta, as well as most of the set, they've been really good. And then something like a Bloodthirster for a mass amount of healing. You can also build a Hodge, but I think Hodge sometimes makes her a little bit too glassy. I think you get a little bit more healing if you use Bloodthirster, and the health shield gives her a little bit more survivability. So I think your crit chance is high enough without the Hodge, but of course, to each their own. You can just go for this and try and like absolutely nuke people with massive amounts of damage. But typically, I'll like to put a Bloodthirster. Nocturne, a lot of times I like to have IE on Nocturne. I think that the damage doesn't feel that great without it. And then obviously you need healing. And then the last item, depending on matchup, you can either go for something that makes them have a little bit more survivability, like a Sterix or an Edge of Night or something like that. But it's a lot of times it's based on what you hit and what augments you hit and stuff like that. But a lot of times I'll just have like, some set like this, right? Some level of tankiness as well as AD, and then a bunch of crit chance. Because he auto attacks so much that it's gonna get realized anyways. AD items can also work on Mbessa if you have multiple AD item pairings. Similar melee AD items would work nicely on Mbessa, so you can build her in a similar way. A lot of times with Mbessa, because she dives the backline, I do like to have an Edge of Night on her, but that's only if you're playing around Mbessa carry. And then Twisted Fate. I usually put, I like Archangels on him. He has an ability where he like hits the backline. A lot of times your front line is super tanky, because if you're going for Twisted Fate 3, you're often going for Loris 3. So you often have enough front line with these builds to kind of just like make it work. So a lot of times I'll go for Archangels. You need something to help them cast, like a Shojin. And then last item is usually pretty flexible. But you can go for like the full casting build and go like Shojin Nashers. But often I'll just put like, another damage item on him just to be safe. Like something like I can't find it. Like a damage amp of some sort, like a guard breaker. Right? Something that gives him some damage amp. I like these a little bit more because he has so much attack speed from Quick Striker that I don't feel like you need an attack speed item, but to each their own. Usually it's just like these 2 items are the priority, and then you figure out the rest afterwards. Additionally, Quick Striker's got another buff in the fact that if you're playing around Nocturne primarily, this is more trying to play around like Akali and TF. But if you're playing primarily around Nocturne, 4 Automata is probably a go-to option. So with 4 Automata, a lot of times you're going for Blitzcrank 3 and Nocturne 3, and ideally maybe Akali 3. But basically, you can play around 4 Automata, and then if you had an Automata emblem, you can play around 6 Automata. Automata got a overall buff, and also all the Automata units, like Blitzcrank got a buff, Amumu got a buff, right? So like the Automata units themselves are extremely strong this patch, to a point where like a lot of people are playing around Blitzcrank just being a strong unit already. With this type of build, a lot of times it's similar, but now instead of itemizing lures, you typically itemize your Blitzcrank instead. You can also go for TF3, like it depends on who you hit. A lot of times you want at least 2 damage dealers 3-starred. Akali got a lot of buffs, so Akali is quite strong. But so you usually go for Nocturne 3 or Kali 3, but there are situations where you go for TF3 as well. So we talked about Nocturne items before. The other thing that's really broken, this is why I personally don't like Quick Strikers being in the meta. I feel like Quick Strikers was already pretty strong. There was a lot of lobbies where if people had good spots for it, they would top 4. And a lot of times the good spot for Quick Striker is, you guessed it, artifacts. So artifacts is like the main win con, because if you remember, it's always been a thing and it still is. If you get any range on this Nocturne unit, Nocturne doesn't have built-in Omnivamp, but he does a massive amount of damage. So if you just make him into a backline unit so you don't have to build Omnivamp on him, he kind of just pops off. So all of the +1 range Ornn artifacts are extremely broken on Nocturne. But this comp in particular, last time it was meta, was when artifacts were a lot more easily findable, just because there was more augments they gave artifacts, namely like Artifactory that they removed from the game. The reason that artifacts are so good is that pretty much all of the artifacts are usable. All the AP ones you can easily put on TF and Akali, so things like Deathfire, like all of these, like anything, like even Horizon Focus, TF has a stun, so it's fine on him. Like Deathfire, Wit's End, Zhonya's, like all of these are really broken on the AP units. And additionally, Blitzcrank has a shield, and even if you play the other variation around TF, Loris also has a shield. Of the units in the game, these are 2 of the best users of things like Unending Despair, as well as other, like there's like basically like all the frontline Ornn artifacts also work really well on the roster. All the backline ones work really well on the roster. So a lot of times, like, this is like I'm just gonna rip an Ornn artifact comp the game, basically. So you should always be aware of that. If it's like a Jason counter, be prepared to be playing around or potentially seeing a lot of people play around Quick Strikers. And if it's not a Jason counter and you're playing around Quick Strikers or artifacts, it's really hard to miss, right? You have multiple options that work well on Nocturne. We haven't even talked about like the more melee options that also still work. Things like these ones, like, where is it? Zhonya's, and this can also work on Akali, right? Zhonya's, which is like a survivability thing. Death Defiance, which is really good here. Suspicious Trenchcoat is really good on Mbessa because she stuns and she just splits up and just starts stunning the whole board, right? You really can't miss on Ornn artifacts with these comps, both variations. So a lot of times, that's something you should be prepared to play around as well. Next. So this was a comp that was really strong in the last patch, but it's actually Zeri. Zeri was pretty much the only 2-cost comp that didn't really receive any nerfs and actually received a lot of buffs to one of the ways that you played around Zeri in the past, right? Urgot got completely gutted. It's pretty much impossible to play Urgot reroll. Tristana is probably still fine outside of Urgot reroll, but it's just really situational because Tristana was always situational. One of the main benefits of playing around Tristana last patch was that you had the option of also stabilizing around Urgot as well. So I don't know how that one kind of shapes out anymore. So I would be cautious to angle yourself towards Tristana off of a round start. Because it might be a little bit more dependent around playing like a Sentinel frontline, for example. Zeri, you usually played with Sentinels before. But the thing that's really great is that Watchers got a lot of buffs. The individual units as well as the trait got buffed in the upcoming patch. So what's really great about this is that now you can play Zeri with Watchers, and it often might even be preferred. Another thing that got buffed is snipers in general. Not only 2 sniper, but 4 sniper. So you actually have a lot of high cap potential, especially if you get an emblem, either a Watcher or a sniper emblem, and you're playing around Zeri reroll. Zeri is an auto attacker, so a lot of times if you're building around a front line that is a massive amount of front line, right, like 6 Watcher deep into a vertical trait, maxing out the vertical trait, then what you usually want is just to ramp her up with as much attack speed as possible. Double Guinsoo is pretty good with a Gunblade. I would usually prioritize Guinsoo and Gunblade. Just the way that Zeri works is she ramps up and then starts doing a bunch of extra damage because she zaps between multiple targets. Once she ramps up, basically the Gunblade becomes like a constant stream of Omnivamp and healing for everybody. So once she gets to like that critical mass where she's maxing out her attack speed, it's extremely powerful. Because she wants to get to that point as soon as possible, a lot of times double Guinsoo is the go-to build on her. It looks a bit weird, but trust me, this is usually what people would consider to be the strongest option for Zeri. However, it is dependent on you having a very strong front line. If not, a lot of times you can go Guinsoo, Gunblade, and a damage item. You might prefer this. This might be your go-to build. Guinsoo, Gunblade, and IE. It's not bad. It's fine. Situationally, the other one works in a little bit more situations, but situationally, this is actually stronger in some boards. So be aware. But usually you want at least Guinsoo, Gunblade, and then +1, your last item, right? Before you would play Zeri around Sentinels, so I'm just going to put it on the board real fast and just explain. But basically, Sentinels themselves got a lot of nerfs, and the Watchers got a lot of buffs, so it's actually a little bit more reliable. Let me just put the Sentinels in the second row, just so we can, like, evaluate the differences between the boards. Obviously, you're not going to play all these units. That would be crazy. But before you played Zeri all the time with Sentinels, because you don't really care too much about Firelight, and the Sentinels just gave, like, good buffs innately, right? Like, Rel was just really good. Singe is really good because of the attack speed bonus on the Zeri. Alawi was really good, and you could often just play around this. Watchers, I think, is a little bit more stable and a little bit more flexible now, because you can play around 6 Watchers, of course, which is this variation where you find the Garen eventually, and you can go for 3-star Vander, got buffed quite a bit, as well as 3-star Scar. I think even I don't remember. I think Vlad got a buff as well. But you can also go for 3-star Vlad. So you have a lot of options here. Additionally, because of the changes to Sniper, there's actually a case for if you find a Caitlyn and you have a massive amount of damage with this Caitlyn, you can actually pivot this into playing a similar board that I showed before when I was talking about Twitch, where you can play 4 Sniper and 4 Watcher. So this is a really high cap variation of this board. A lot of times when you go for these like lower frontline trait type of boards like this, where you're only playing 4 Watcher, 4 Watcher with a Garen 2, and if you have like a Vander 3, I think 4 Watcher, like of all of them, like if you think about 4 Bruiser, 4 Sentinel, 4 Watcher, 4 Watcher to me is the most stable of the front lines if you're not maxing out a trait, just because of how much defensive stats it gives. The durability that it gives is just massive, and you can often play around a better group of 4 units that synergize well with your board. But I would only go for this if I have a Caitlyn, or if you have a Sniper emblem. But the 4 Sniper bonus, especially with Zeri, they reposition, so you'll often always find a way to get maximum Sniper value because you reposition with the Firelight trait. 4 Watcher, 4 Sniper might also be a good variation to play. Obviously, this is dependent on, number 1, finding a Caitlyn. Number 2, you also have to pay attention to your opponent's board. You might have to adapt on the fly, right? Play 4 Sniper against some boards that you need the extra damage, and play 4 Watcher against boards where you need the extra front line. But the comp actually became something that looks like quite a bit more flexible, so be prepared for this, because compared to a lot of the other rerolls, like Renata has a lot of nerfs, so it just feels like it's a little bit worse. I wasn't a big believer in Renata last patch. I know everybody's like, this Renata comp is busted, but a lot of times it was like, you know, everybody played it, but like unless you hit your units and you really like, unless you had like Starry Night or like one of the augments that helps you to hit the board really effectively, it wasn't like that crazy. So now that it got nerfed, it's like, I don't think it's like a top 1 comp is what I'm trying to say. I still think you can top 4 with Renata, but it's not going to make the cut of this list, because I think Zeri is just a little bit more reliable and you have more options to play around it. So this is like kind of like what Renata was before the nerf, if that makes sense. And there might be a lot of people forcing towards Zeri snipers, so be prepared for that as well. I think this comp takes the place, either this comp or the Nocturne Akali comp. Both of them have flexibility as well as really good value for rolling, as well as many 2 costs and many different types of itemizations. So those 2 comps collectively kind of take the place of what Renata was last patch, is what I'm trying to explain. Lastly, family. So this is another case of some of its parts. I would like to say the family changes that were announced in the patch notes did not go through. They said that they didn't want to do it. So there is no extra mana buff to the family bonus that you have, so please be aware of that. But anyways, when you think about family, it's something that used to be really strong. I don't think family is as strong as Zeri reroll or Nocturne Akali reroll. However, it is something that's very reliable, and you do have a lot of win conditions. So a lot of times when you're playing around family, you typically play around Violet, and you're going for Violet 3-star. You're often capable of 3-starring everybody if you want, and then you can just play around like Draven with items, Powder with items, because Powder got a lot of buffs. But typically you're playing around Violet with items, and then you cap out this board around just playing Vertical Pit Fighter. This was the old way of playing family. You typically just do something like this. Now, if you're building Violet items, typically the Violet items that you want are something like frontline, damage, and survivability. So this was what I used to like to do. I used to like to build her like this, with like IE, Hodge, Bloodthirster, but things have changed a lot, so sometimes extra tankiness is a little bit better. So something like Asterix Titans might also work out really nicely just for survivability until you get to your for Pit Fighter. But I strongly think that she's quite flexible in her itemizations. It's just that the family comp being 1 cost, they balance it in such a way that it's not like giga broken. It's not like something that's insanely gonna win you out every single game. Sorry, I'm still trying to find Titans. It's not something that's gonna win you out every game, but it's just very consistent because you're playing around low cost units. A lot of times with Draven, it's Gwinsu plus other items because you really want to have attack speed. With Powder, a lot of times you can activate Scrap, but a lot of times she's getting like the extra items. With Ambusher, you can often get the crit chance, so I like to build her with like stuff like Damage Amp with Crit Glove, so Guard Breaker, and maybe like a Nashor's, because she does have quite a bit of attack speed, so it actually works out really nicely. And then some sort of like mana generation item, either the Shojin or blue buff even maybe. When you're building around these units though, something that's really important to note is that the family board can cap very high with different situations. So if you have a family emblem, for example, family gives a mana buff, right? So it reduces their max mana. Often when you're playing around family and you have a family bonus, often it's good to play around Echo. Echo with a family emblem is extremely strong because the mana buff that you get for the Echo allows them to cast a lot, and you also have Ambusher active with the Powder. So often you can cap out your board. Instead of playing deep into Pit Fighter, you can play around a board like this if you start the game with a family emblem. The only reason I'm mentioning it because there are different variations of family besides the Pit Fighter. I will go through an in-depth family guide tomorrow, hopefully. So that will be really fun. It will be like my how to play family guide that I was kind of holding off for a little bit. But typically, another thing that you often want to play around, family with is Savika Encounter, right? If you're playing Savika or Loot Sub, basically every round you get some loot, right? So the main thing that you did, this existed last patch, but now because family like Vander got buffs, Powder got buffs, 2 Conqueror got buffs, like this whole board basically got a bunch of buffs. Pit Fighter got buffs. Every aspect of this board, and as well as both ways to cap out the board, did get a lot of buffs. So typically you're playing around, like I said before, you're playing around Violet and you're playing deep into the Pit Fighter trait, right? Something like this. This is your typical family board, and you just play 6 Pit Fighter and you call it a day. You make it to level 9, you get Savika 2, this guy 2, and then you can put your family emblems if you have them. Something that's really crazy is that with Savika, you actually have a really high chance of getting extra emblems. And with 5 family, especially if you can hit 5 family, it gives you lots of cash outs that usually helps you to convert and like make your position into like an instant win. So this used to be a strategy. If you were in Savika Encounter and you saw a family emblem, you often just played around family, and it would guarantee you a top 4 in an otherwise very like crazy style of game. And the reason it was so good is because if you go under like loot, if you think about like the loot sub odds, you actually have a really high chance, 14% of a spatula, and like 14% of a spatula, 13% of a support item, and then what's the last one? There's like Orn Artifact as well, 14% of an Orn Artifact, all of which can work really well with family, right? If you find like a Trench Coat, for example, is really good on, like, of the Orn Artifacts, Trench Coat is really good on Violet, right? Silvermere Dawn is really good on Violet. Trench Coat's really good on Violet. Death's Defiance is really good on Violet, right? You have a lot of options to like cap out this board really high with an Orn Artifact. But additionally, you're also playing towards the idea that if you just hit the extra spatula, right? If you're playing around family, you could just get to 5 family, and you don't have to like, it's not like Rebel, it's not like these other traits where you have 2 spats and you have to reach some high level. You're basically 5 family on level 5. So a lot of times if you start the game off and your augment was family emblem and it was loot sub, a lot of times you would just play towards it because you're playing a consistent reroll line that often gives you a good out in an otherwise very wild and adventurous style of game. And then you also have the potential to high roll if you get the spat. You're just instantly 5 family, get your cash outs early, and you just win the game for free, often killing people before they can even reach their stretch goals of like 10 rebel or 9 scrap or blah blah blah, whatever those ones are. But anyways, that's just something to mention. I'll talk about it more in the family guide that I will do tomorrow. So overall, we kind of talked about it, right? Obviously comps can change, things can be adjusted, stats are very fake right now because obviously it's the first day of the patch, but from my experience of what I've been seeing and what I've played, these are the kind of like handful of comps that I think would give you some good success early on. Of course, there might be different optimizations, and you might see things change a little bit over time, and there'll be more guides to come as we learn more about the game on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe if you do like my content. Hopefully this helps you out, especially if you're beginning the game, just to give you some things to, like, think about or team planner up. Have fun, enjoy, and see ya. Bye bye.